Today we're going to talk about bias. Bias goes hand in hand with research and consumption of information. So let's talk about this. So what is bias, first and foremost? I'm sure that we've all heard this term. We might not exactly know what it is, though. Bias, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, is an inclination of temperament or outlook. And dictionary.com says bias is a particular tendency, trend, inclination, feeling, or opinion, especially one that is preconceived or unreasoned. It also says that bias can be unreasonably hostile feelings or opinions about a social group or prejudice. So if I had to put these definitions into my own words, I would say an assumption or a feeling or opinion about something without concrete information. Some types of bias. There are lots of types. I pulled some of the ones that might be most familiar to you. Beauty bias. We are biased. Notice that I'm saying B-I-A-S-E-D. We as people are biased about beauty. What does that mean? We have an opinion or a preconceived notion about what physical beauty is. And that's something that society has placed on us, that females should be tall, thin, curvy, whatever. That's a beauty bias that society has. Another type of bias is called an affinity bias. We all do this without realizing it. We might automatically like another person more because they went to the same school as us or grew up in the same town or they know somebody that we know. Automatically, if I have a student come up and say that they're a fan of the University of Florida, versus if another student comes up and says they're a fan of the University of Central Florida, I might have an automatic affinity bias against the UF fan and for the UCF fan. This happens pretty frequently if you have a sibling who also attended AHS. Perhaps your teachers have an affinity bias towards you. Could be positive or negative depending on if they liked or disliked your sibling. Confirmation bias is when we make judgments about other people without any evidence, and then we try to find evidence to back up our opinion because we already have formed an opinion about someone. So this happens a lot with people we don't like. Say I don't like Bob, and I have a confirmation bias. I'm judging Bob because I just don't like him. He rubs me the wrong way. Then when I find out that Bob, Bob is a bad teacher, then I'm like, well, obviously he's a bad teacher because I already didn't like him. And so you're kind of going backwards instead of moving forwards through making an assumption based on evidence. With confirmation bias, you're finding evidence to fit what you already believe. It's backwards. And of course, media bias. This is the kind of bias that we fall victim to on a regular basis. When I was y'all's age, I didn't have to deal with as much media bias. Now in 2020, it's everywhere. And so I'm sure that you've heard this term before, probably most commonly in the field of media and news. You'll see in the graphic that some words like prejudice, discrimination, racism, stereotypes. We learned a lot first semester in this course all about those concepts. Bias is very clearly related to those things. We might discriminate against another person because we have a bias about their race, or we have a bias, a preconceived judgment about their gender, their age, the way they look, what they believe, so on and so forth. So let's talk about media bias because I think that's most relevant to us at this point. So I found an article written about Christmas decorations at the White House recently in 2019. Fashion editor Robin Given wrote an article all about the Christmas decor at the White House, as people always do because it's a big deal how the president and the first lady choose to decorate the White House every year for the holidays. This guy, though, this fashion editor, spent a paragraph talking about the decorations, and then he moved on to the following 3 paragraphs that I have here. So this is an excerpt from his Christmas decorations article, rather. He said, once he moved on from the decorations, for her tour, Mrs. Trump wears all white, a dress with a simple jewel neckline, white stiletto-heeled pumps, and a white coat. The coat is draped over her shoulders as she strolls through the White House. The coat looks ridiculous. But more than a silly fashion folly, the coat is a distraction. It's a discomforting affectation taken to a ludicrous extreme. In a video that is intended to celebrate the warmth and welcoming spirit of the holiday season, that simple flourish exudes cold, dismissive aloofness. As Trump gazes pleasantly at all that her staff and host of volunteers have accomplished, her attire suggests that she's casually passing through and has little affinity for the occasion. She's not getting comfortable, so why should you? Keep in mind, the article that was written by this fashion editor was all about the Christmas decorations. He mentions in paragraph 3 that Melania Trump, pictured in this image, pleasantly looks at all of the accomplishments that her staff and volunteers have made. Keep in mind, presidents and first ladies don't do the decorating. They might make decisions, but they have a staff. So that's what he's referring to, the people who actually did the decorations. So if you see Melania Trump there in that image, she's wearing this aforementioned white coat, and she's looking at the Christmas decor, and this was a photograph that went along with this article about Christmas decorations. So since we're talking about bias today, I implore you to think, what is biased about this article, about this excerpt of the article? Keep in mind, it is an article written about Christmas decorations at the White House. So how is this excerpt biased? Notice the ED, biased. You guys frequently make that mistake in your writing. Previous First Lady Michelle Obama was not criticized like this in any of the Christmas decor articles that I looked over. The fashion editor is putting politics before fashion. Keep in mind, his job is to talk about the Christmas decorations and the quality of the Christmas decorations, not talk about Melania Trump in a biased way, clearly because of his dislike of her husband. The author of this article is going after her and her coat because of a dislike for the person she's married to. My thought when I was reading that was, oof, this feels a little harsh. Who's looking at that picture and saying her coat looks ridiculous? And those were the fashion editor, the article author's words. I didn't look at that picture and say, oof, what a hideous coat. I looked at the picture and said, oh, Melania Trump is looking at the decorations, and that's it. So an article like that certainly shows judgment and opinions of the author about an issue. He is making biased statements towards Melania Trump and her coat, rather than focusing on the issue that he should be writing about, which is Christmas decorations. So there is bias everywhere in the news. Right now, you might be thinking, oh yeah, Fox News is biased, or oh yeah, CNN is biased. But in fact, there is a lot more media out there that shows bias in their writing, more than just the 2 sources that are most frequently discussed. Why does this matter? There are a lot of problems with including bias in our media. First of all, it's all we have to go off of. So if we are watching the news or reading the news and we're absorbing that information as fact, we need to be able to identify as readers and viewers if the information is biased and if we can take it objectively. There's no problem with reading information or viewing information that is biased as long as you are aware of that bias. And so that is part of my goal for you all this week, is to practice being critical consumers of what we are reading and viewing. The news, by definition, is supposed to be unbiased and it's supposed to be objective. Facts, facts, facts. And we've gotten away from that in the last 10 plus years. It can be dangerous if we don't know that we're reading a news source that is biased, because then we might absorb those opinions as viewers or as readers. And once we absorb those opinions without realizing we're absorbing those opinions, then we're going to spread those opinions and that bias. And that's not the goal. Keep in mind that bias is very closely linked to prejudice, discrimination, stereotyping, and hatred. Also ignorance. If you're aware that you're reading bias, fine. If you're not, that's when it starts to get dangerous. So let's take a look at this really fancy chart that is available to you. I'll show you the link here in a moment if you are interested in perusing the website and the creators of this graphic. I love this chart because it shows a couple of things. I'm going to walk you through it, so stay with me, follow me right now. So on the top of this chart, we're looking at political bias. We are looking at, from the left, the most extreme, all the way then to the middle, we have neutral, or there's very little political bias, and on the right, we have extreme bias again. Politically, the left is usually more Democrat, and the right is usually more Republican, politically. On the left-hand side of this chart, we have overall source reliability. And so on this axis, towards the top, we have original fact reporting. So towards the top of the left axis, that's where there are facts, objective, concrete facts. If you look towards the bottom of the left axis, the key on the left, we have less reliable information. Propaganda, it's selective. It could be an attempt at persuasion rather than objective facts being presented. And so we're going to use these two axes to try to figure out what then is the most reliable in terms of research. We're focused here today on research because that is our ultimate goal with this unit that we are moving into, is research. On the right-hand side of this chart, we have a color-coded key. And I really like this. Hopefully you can see the color differences on the screen. In green, the teeny tiny dots, it says most reliable for news, objective, factual, minimally biased, and reliable news. So if you're using the two axes, we have reliable and bias. In green, the green box is most reliable and the least biased. Orange says reliable for news, but high in analysis or opinion. So factual news, but perhaps the reporters of that media source do express their opinions a bit. The darker orange says there are reliability issues and there is extremism, meaning there is going to be some bias and the reliability level is minimal. And then in red, serious reliability issues. In other words, read it, enjoy it, but it is not a reliable source in terms of the content that it is providing for research. So take a couple of minutes right now to look over this chart. A lot of the sources overlap. Look through it. Maybe some of it surprises you. See what news stations or newspapers or whatever kind of media you read or view, see where they are on here. Some of them might surprise you in positive or negative ways. So just take a couple of minutes right now to peruse this chart. If I were to ask you, based on this graph, this chart, what is the least biased, most reliable source present on this graph? I would hope that you would say the Associated Press, AP. It's in the green box on the top. Notice the little blue box next to it is the Weather Channel. I'm quite pleased to see that the Weather Channel is also minimally biased and reliable for weather and whatever else news that it provides. ABC News is right below that as well. The further down you move, the less reliable. The further left and right, the more politically biased. The two news sources that are always disputed in terms of political bias are CNN and Fox News. Those two media sources are always juxtaposed when people talk about bias and unreliable sources. If you notice on there, they are both around the middle of the chart in terms of reliability. Fox News appears to be just a teeny bit below that in terms of reliability, but it does skew right. And CNN is more on the left, skews left. Here's the link for the political media bias chart if you would like to access it on your own. And so now what? Ask yourself, do you regularly read news from the extremely politically biased sources or the unreliable sources? Is that okay? What if you supplemented your news sources with a minimally biased, more reliable news source like the Associated Press, which is towards the top of that chart? So we all have our favorite news sources. I have my favorite news source as well. I have a particular source that I enjoy reading. Some of you have your favorite news source, and it's based on what's on in your household, what your parents like. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we have to be thinkers and critical consumers. Could we supplement that news source with a less politically biased, more reliable source? And ask yourself, is there any harm in doing that? Because there's nothing wrong with watching what you like to watch or reading what you like to read, but what if we looked at the factual, objective, reliable sources in addition? Think about how that could benefit us. I'm not saying that you have to read something that you don't agree with, but in theory, the minimally biased, more reliable sources towards the very top of that chart would be more objective and fact-based, stats, concrete stuff that is fact-checkable. So think about that. Maybe these are some questions that you start to think about, especially as we are home and we have a little bit more free time. So as I discussed in our live session today, you're going to be researching on your own whatever issue you have selected and gets approved by me. I'm going to ask that you consider using the objective, reliable, unbiased sources for this task. You can absolutely supplement your learning about the issue with whatever news sources you personally prefer. But for research, I want you to stick with the unbiased, reliable sources when possible. You will be using databases. The handout attached on Planbook will give you a list of databases that are available for your use. And you can also be using some of these sources on that media bias chart to be getting your information. So for this task, let's stick with minimally biased and reliable facts and objective sources. Let's see what happens, because more than likely when you guys go to college, those of you who are college bound, you will be required to use databases and reliable unbiased sources there as well. So we're going to try this out. Hopefully this was helpful information for you. Again, if you'd like to access that media bias chart, the link was a few slides ago. All right, good luck.